I've never been the type to trust strangers, but with rent prices going up, I decided to rent out the small studio I have in my backyard. It wasn't anything fancy, a cozy space with a bed, a bathroom, and a tiny kitchen, perfect for travelers or anyone needing a short-term stay. I always used Airbnb to manage bookings, and so far, everything had gone smoothly. The rules were clear. Check in at 2 p.m. and check out by noon. I handled the cleaning myself to save on extra costs, and because I liked making sure everything was in order. Last week, I got a booking from a guy named Lucas. He seemed about my age, maybe in his early 30s, and told me he was coming to town for a job interview. Apparently, he was just passing through and needed the place for 2 nights. It sounded straightforward. He sent a polite message thanking me in advance for the stay, and everything seemed normal. The check-in went smoothly. I left him the instructions with the smart lock code and trusted he'd follow the rules, like every other guest before him. 2 days later, right around checkout time, I went over to the studio to clean up and prepare it for the next guest. When I opened the door, I immediately noticed how spotless it was. Almost too clean. The bed was made, the towels were neatly hung in the bathroom, and there wasn't a single piece of trash in the bin. It felt odd, but not impossible. Some people do leave things in perfect condition. Still, something about it didn't sit right. As I kept looking around, I stepped into the bathroom and saw something that sent a small chill down my spine. The complimentary toothbrush I always leave was sitting out on the counter, but it wasn't in its usual spot. It was a tiny detail, but it felt off. Trying to brush it off, I kept cleaning until I decided to check the security camera footage. I have a camera facing the studio's entrance for safety reasons, and it's become a habit to review the footage if something feels weird. As I scrolled through the videos, I saw Lucas arriving on the first day with just a backpack, pretty standard. But then, the second night, at around 11 p.m., the footage showed another man entering the studio, using the same lock code. He wasn't on the reservation, and Lucas hadn't mentioned bringing anyone. My heart started racing. Who was this guy, and what was he doing there? I tried to convince myself it might have been a friend Lucas invited over, maybe for a drink or to hang out. But the more I watched the footage, the weirder it felt. This second guy wasn't just visiting. He brought a large bag with him, and he didn't leave. The next morning, Lucas was seen walking out of the studio alone, but there was no footage of the other man leaving. I replayed the footage over and over, trying to make sense of it, but there was nothing. It was like the guy was still in there. Feeling uneasy, I decided to check the studio one more time before locking it up for good. I opened every closet, checked every cabinet, and even looked under the bed. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were smudges of dirt on the floor under the bed, like something heavy had been dragged across it. I couldn't find anything under there or in the closets that explained it, but the sight of those marks made my skin crawl. I grabbed my phone and messaged Lucas, asking if he knew anything about the extra guest. He read the message but didn't reply. That's when I felt the first real wave of panic. This wasn't just some careless guest. Later that night, I was trying to shake off the uneasiness when my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. The text said, "Why did you lock the window?" My stomach turned. The only window I'd touched was the one in the bathroom earlier that day, which had been left slightly open when I arrived. I froze. Was someone watching me while I was there? My first instinct was to call the police, but I hesitated. What could I say? That someone might still be in the studio, even though I hadn't found them? Instead, I blocked the number and tried to sleep, though my mind was racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The next morning, I decided to check the security camera footage again, this time carefully watching for any movement I might have missed. That's when I saw something that chilled me to my core. Around 2 a.m., the camera caught someone standing near the studio door. The figure didn't try to get in. They just stood there for at least 20 minutes before vanishing into the darkness. It was hard to make out any details because of the poor lighting, but it wasn't Lucas, and whoever it was, they knew exactly where to stand to avoid being seen clearly. At this point, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I called the police and explained everything. About Lucas, the other man on the camera, and the strange message I'd received. They sent an officer over to check out the studio and review the footage. 2 officers searched the place while another asked me questions outside. They looked through every nook and cranny but didn't find anyone. Just when I thought they were going to dismiss me as paranoid, one of them called me over. Under the bed, they found something I hadn't noticed before. A small hole in the wooden floorboards. It wasn't big, but it was enough to be concerning. One of the officers lifted the mattress and the bed frame to inspect it further, and what they found made my stomach churn. There was a small hidden compartment under the bed. It was empty now, but it was clear someone had been using it. The officers didn't say much, just that I should keep the studio locked up and maybe install more cameras. I nodded, but my mind was racing. Someone had been hiding there, maybe for days, and I'd had no idea. After they left, I couldn't stop staring at that hole. It felt like it was staring back at me, a reminder that my sense of safety had been completely shattered. I covered it up with some heavy duct tape and promised myself I'd fix it properly the next day. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, as I tried to sleep, my phone buzzed again. It was another message from an unknown number. This time it said, "I'll be back." My blood ran cold. The number was different from the last one, so blocking it wouldn't do much good. I couldn't sleep after that. Every little sound made me jump. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to rent out the studio anymore. I pulled the listing from Airbnb and decided to leave the place empty for now. It wasn't worth the risk. Since then, I haven't received any more messages, but I still think about that hidden compartment and the man who disappeared without a trace. Who was he? And what was he planning? I'll probably never know. I'm 28 years old and still trying to figure things out in my life. I live alone in a small apartment, working a job that barely covers my bills, and the pandemic just made everything harder. A few months ago, after an especially tough week at work, I felt like I needed to get away. I was exhausted, annoyed, and just done with everything. So, I decided to rent an Airbnb out in the middle of nowhere for the weekend. Nothing fancy, just a quiet spot to recharge. I found this small, simple cabin in a little village called Maplewood, about 3 hours away. The pictures made it look cozy, surrounded by trees, the perfect escape. I packed my bag quickly, grabbing clothes, some toiletries, and my laptop for watching movies. When I got there, the village was exactly what I'd hoped for. Quiet streets, barely anyone around, and that kind of silence you only get far away from the city. The cabin was tucked at the end of a dirt road, a bit secluded. As soon as I parked, I felt an instant wave of relief. The owner had left detailed instructions on how to get in and turn on the electricity. The cabin itself was small but cozy, with a bright living room, a compact kitchen, and a bedroom with a comfortable bed. It seemed like the perfect spot to unwind. The first night was peaceful. I made a quick snack, opened up my laptop, and started watching a movie. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and the darkness was almost absolute. It felt a little odd not hearing cars or neighbors, but I was enjoying it. After a while, the Wi-Fi started acting up, so I decided to call it a night. Before heading to bed, I double-checked the windows and doors to make sure everything was locked. I'm not usually paranoid, but being in such an isolated spot made me extra cautious. The next morning, I enjoyed some coffee I had brought and decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a little trail that led to a small lake nearby. On my walk, I passed a few old houses that looked like no one had lived in them for years. One of them had a rusty bike left on the porch, which gave me a weird feeling, but I shrugged it off. After walking around for a bit, I went back to the cabin to make lunch. That's when I noticed something strange. The back door, which I was sure I had locked the night before, was slightly open. The wind wasn't strong enough to do that, and I started second-guessing myself. I quickly closed the door and checked the rest of the cabin, trying to convince myself I'd just forgotten to lock it properly. Nothing seemed out of place, and there weren't any signs that someone had been inside. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I decided to recheck all the locks just to be safe and spent the rest of the afternoon inside. I tried distracting myself by reading, but every now and then, I'd glance out the window, half expecting to see something or someone out there. It felt irrational, but the quietness of the place made every little sound stand out. Later, while making a sandwich in the kitchen, I heard footsteps outside. They were slow and deliberate, crunching against the leaves just outside the cabin. My stomach dropped and I froze, gripping the knife in my hand. For a second, I thought maybe it was a deer or some animal passing by, but the footsteps didn't sound like an animal. They sounded like a person. I turned off the lights in the living room and peeked out through the curtain. At first, I didn't see anything, just shadows. But then I spotted a figure standing between the trees, barely lit by the moonlight. I ducked down quickly, my heart racing, and tried to figure out what to do. I stayed low, trying not to make a sound. Whoever was out there wasn't moving, just standing in the same spot, watching the cabin. I thought about calling the police, but the cell signal out there was awful, and I wasn't even sure what I'd say. "Hey, I think someone's outside," didn't seem like it would get a quick response. After what felt like forever, I heard the footsteps again, this time moving away. I waited a few more minutes before cautiously looking out the window again. The figure was gone. I wanted to believe it was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was might come back. Later that night, I was sitting in the living room with all the lights off, just listening. Every little sound made me jump. Then, out of nowhere, I heard something scrape against the side of the cabin, like nails or a stick dragging along the wood. My stomach twisted. Whoever had been out there hadn't left. They were still nearby. I grabbed the biggest knife I could find from the kitchen and sat on the floor in the corner of the living room, gripping it tightly. I didn't know what else to do. The minutes felt like hours, and the silence was somehow worse than the noise. I was scared out of my mind. After what felt like an eternity, the scraping stopped and everything went dead silent. I didn't know if that was a good sign or if whoever was out there was just waiting for me to let my guard down. I eventually got the courage to peek out the window again. At first, everything looked normal, just the same dark woods and shadows. But as I scanned the area, I noticed something on one of the windows, a smudged handprint. My heart dropped. That hadn't been there earlier. Someone had been right up against the cabin, and I hadn't even heard them. I grabbed my flashlight and quickly scanned the rest of the windows. That's when I saw it. Someone was standing right outside the living room window, their face just barely visible in the beam of light. I couldn't make out any features, but I knew for sure it was a person. I froze, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped the flashlight. Without thinking, I bolted to the bedroom, locked the door, and pushed the dresser against it. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, clutching the knife and my phone, hoping they wouldn't try to break in. A few minutes later, I heard the sound I was dreading. Slow, heavy footsteps inside the cabin. My stomach turned. I was sure I had locked every door and window, but somehow they had gotten in. The footsteps were deliberate, almost casual, like they weren't in a hurry. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. They wanted me to know they were there. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't come to the bedroom. Then, I heard the doorknob jiggle. They were trying to open the bedroom door. I stayed completely still, gripping the knife tightly, praying they wouldn't try to force it open. After a few seconds, the jiggling stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. I couldn't tell if they had left or if they were still standing there, just waiting. I didn't dare move. I stayed frozen in place, listening for any hint of movement, every nerve in my body on edge. Eventually, I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were moving away. A few seconds later, I heard the faint sound of the front door opening and closing. I waited, still frozen in place, trying to figure out if it was really over. I didn't hear any more footsteps or sounds from inside the cabin. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. How had they gotten in? Why hadn't they done more than just walk around? Nothing about it made sense, and the silence that followed only made it creepier. After what felt like hours, the first light of dawn started to creep through the window. I didn't sleep at all that night. The moment I felt like it was safe, I packed up my stuff as quickly as I could, threw everything into the car, and left without looking back. Driving down that dirt road, every shadow between the trees made my skin crawl. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was nothing. Still, I didn't feel completely safe until I was back home, far away from that place. Even after getting home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I started reading reviews of the Airbnb to see if anyone else had experienced something similar. That's when I came across a couple of comments that made my stomach drop. One person mentioned feeling like they were being watched the entire time they were there. Another said the owner had been super friendly and even stopped by late at night to check on them. I hadn't seen the owner during my stay, but those comments made me feel sick. Could they have been involved? To this day, I still don't have an explanation for what happened that night. I keep replaying it in my head, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. But the truth is, I'll never know who that person was, how they got in, or why they were there. All I know is that I'm never staying in an isolated Airbnb again. Whatever peace I thought I'd find out there was completely shattered, and I don't think I'll ever forget the sound of those footsteps. A few years ago, I moved into a small apartment in an old building on the 3rd floor after starting a new job. It was a modest place, but cozy enough for me to live on my own for the first time. The first week was quiet. Nothing unusual happened, until I started hearing footsteps at night. The strange part? I lived on the top floor, so it didn't make any sense. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was just the building settling or my mind playing tricks on me. But the footsteps became more frequent, and one night, I clearly heard something scratching against the wall near my bed. The next morning, I mentioned the noises to my neighbor, Martha, who lived on the 2nd floor. She frowned and said something that gave me chills. The tenant before you used to complain about hearing things too. He said he'd hear footsteps and even felt like someone else was in the apartment. He moved out suddenly, didn't even give notice. I laughed nervously, trying not to let it get to me. That night, I decided to record audio on my phone while I slept, just to prove to myself I was imagining things. When I played it back the next morning, I heard heavy footsteps and, worse, the sound of someone breathing, like they were standing right next to my bed. That night, I left all the lights on while I tried to sleep, but it didn't make me feel any safer. Around midnight, I heard a noise coming from the kitchen, like something falling to the floor. I worked up the courage to check it out and noticed a faint mark on the tile floor, as if something heavy had been dragged. It didn't make sense, but I decided I'd investigate more in the morning when it wasn't so creepy. The next day, while cleaning the kitchen, I noticed a vent near the floor that I hadn't paid attention to before. Curious, I unscrewed the cover and found something tucked inside, a crumpled piece of paper. When I unfolded it, I realized it was an old photo. It was faded and damaged, but I could make out the figure of a man wearing a hood, standing in front of a door. My door. The apartment door. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at the picture. Who put this here? And why? After finding the photo, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I called a friend of mine, Jake, and asked him to come over. I told him everything that had been happening, but he just laughed it off, saying I was probably overthinking. Still, he agreed to spend the night. Around midnight, while we were watching TV, we heard a noise coming from the bathroom. It sounded like a low creak, followed by something that resembled footsteps. Jake tried to act cool, but I could see he was just as freaked out as I was. We cautiously walked to the bathroom, and the door was slightly open, even though I was certain I had closed it earlier. Inside, everything seemed normal, except for one detail. On the bottom corner of the mirror, there was a faint smudge, almost like a damp fingerprint. It definitely wasn't there before. I tried wiping it off, but it didn't budge. Jake started to get visibly uncomfortable and suggested we crash in the living room instead. I agreed, but deep down, I knew something really weird was going on in that apartment. The next morning, I decided I needed to figure out what was happening. I remembered the attic access in the hallway outside my apartment and decided to check it out. Jake hesitated, but eventually agreed to come with me. We pulled down the creaky ladder and climbed up. The attic was cramped, dusty, and filled with old junk. In the far corner, we spotted something that made my stomach drop. A filthy, stained mattress surrounded by scraps of food and crumpled papers. Someone had clearly been living up there, but there was no sign of them now. While we were still in the attic, we suddenly heard creaking noises from the hallway below us. It sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps heading toward the ladder. Jake and I froze, too scared to move. I quickly turned off my flashlight and we waited in silence. The creaking got louder, and then the ladder began to shift, as if someone was climbing up. That was it for me. I grabbed Jake, and we bolted down the ladder, slammed the attic door shut, and locked my apartment door behind us. We didn't waste another second. We were out of that building in minutes. We went straight to the nearest police station and told them everything. The officer on duty seemed skeptical but agreed to send someone to check the apartment and attic. When we returned with him, the first thing we noticed was that my apartment door was wide open, even though I had locked it when we left. Inside, things were off. The furniture I had moved the day before was back in its original place, perfectly arranged like no one had ever touched it. Jake and I exchanged uneasy glances. It was like someone was trying to erase any trace of what had happened. We led the officers to the attic, but when we climbed up, it was completely empty. The mattress, the food scraps, the papers, everything was gone. It looked like no one had been up there for years. The officer shrugged it off, saying it was probably just my imagination or maybe a prank by some squatters. He suggested I change my locks and assured me the building was safe. But I knew better. Whatever had been going on, it wasn't just in my head, and it wasn't gone. I packed up my things that same day. I didn't care about getting my deposit back or explaining myself to the landlord. I just wanted out. To this day, I don't know what was up with that apartment or who might have been hiding in the attic. All I know is, I've never been able to shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me the entire time I lived there. At the beginning of 2023, I had to take a last-minute trip to Chicago for a job interview. Since everything was super rushed and I didn't want to spend too much, I ended up booking an Airbnb in a neighborhood I didn't know well. The place looked fine in the pictures, but honestly, I got a weird vibe when I saw the host profile. It had a generic name, no picture, and barely any details. I thought about canceling, but the location was convenient, and the price was too good to pass up. Plus, it was just 2 nights. When I arrived, the unease kicked in again. The house looked older and way more run-down than it did in the photos, and the street was oddly quiet, even though it wasn't late. I tried to brush it off and went in. The host had left the key under a flower pot on the porch, just like we agreed. The house itself was small and kind of stuffy, with old furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Still, nothing screamed danger at first, so I told myself I was overthinking it. The first thing that bothered me, though, was the front door lock. It felt super flimsy, like one of those you could turn with a coin if it was locked. What really freaked me out was the back door, which wasn't even locked, just pushed closed. I found a key hanging by the entrance and locked it, but it didn't give me much peace of mind. I tried to distract myself by streaming a movie on my laptop, but the Wi-Fi was so bad that I gave up. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night and get some rest before my big interview the next day. That's when things started to get weird. I had been lying in bed for about 20 minutes, unable to fall asleep, when I heard a noise coming from the back of the house. It sounded like someone trying the door I had locked earlier. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to think it was just the wind or something harmless. I stayed still, hoping the noise wouldn't happen again. After a few minutes of silence, I started convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. But just as I was beginning to relax, I heard footsteps, clear as day, right outside the window of my bedroom. The curtains were drawn, but I could tell the steps stopped right by the window. My whole body froze. The only thing I could do was grab my phone and hold it tight, ready to call 911 if I needed to. A few moments passed, and the footsteps moved away, heading toward the front of the house. Then, I heard someone messing with the doorknob. Slowly, I got out of bed and tiptoed toward the door, trying not to make any noise. I peeked through the peephole, but it was pitch black outside. I couldn't see a thing. The noise stopped, and I waited a few seconds before heading back to my bedroom. Just as I was about to sit down, the doorbell rang. It wasn't an insistent ring, just a single ding, like someone testing to see if I'd answer. I froze in place. Then it rang again, louder this time. That's when I heard a low voice, almost a whisper, saying something I couldn't make out. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it had burst out of my chest. I had no idea what to do. My first instinct was to grab a chair and wedge it under the doorknob, making a makeshift barricade. I had no idea who could be outside, but I wasn't about to open the door or respond. Instead, I messaged the Airbnb host, asking if it could be them or someone they knew. Of course, no reply. While I waited, I heard footsteps again, this time moving to the side of the house. They were slow and deliberate, like whoever it was didn't want to be heard. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a metallic sound, like something being dragged or dropped on the ground. My breathing was shaky, and I forced myself to stay quiet, trying to listen carefully. After a few minutes, the sound stopped and everything went silent again. I started to think maybe they had left, but just as I was beginning to calm down, I heard the back door handle rattle. Someone was trying to open it, pulling it harder and harder. My whole body froze. I knew I had locked that door, but I didn't trust that flimsy old lock. With trembling hands, I dialed 911. Before I could even hit call, I heard that low voice again, this time louder. "I know you're in there." My hand shook as I pressed the button to call. As soon as the call connected, the noise stopped. It was dead silent again, so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. I told the dispatcher what was happening, and they promised to send officers, but time felt like it was crawling as I waited. While I waited for the police, I locked myself in the bedroom and barricaded the door with a dresser. I stayed on the phone with the dispatcher, who was trying to keep me calm. Every second felt like an eternity, and the tension was unbearable. Then, I heard a loud noise from the living room, like something heavy had fallen. My heart dropped, and I thought for sure someone had gotten inside. The dispatcher asked what was happening, but I could barely speak. All I managed to whisper was, "Someone's in the house." A few seconds later, I heard footsteps outside my bedroom door. They were slow and deliberate, stopping right in front of the door. I had no weapons, nothing to defend myself with, just the dresser blocking the door. The footsteps stopped, and there was a terrifying silence. Then, I heard the doorknob rattle, like they were trying to open the door. I started shouting, "I'm on the phone with the police. They're on their way." Whoever it was didn't respond, but the rattling stopped. I stayed quiet, listening for any movement. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard sirens in the distance, getting closer. It was a huge relief, but I was still terrified. I waited until I heard banging on the front door and the police shouting before I moved the dresser and unlocked the bedroom door. When I opened the bedroom door, still shaking, I slowly made my way to the front of the house to meet the officers. They told me to stay put while they checked the place. I could hear them walking through the rooms, opening doors and windows, but they didn't say much. A few minutes later, one of them came back to tell me the house was empty. They asked if I was sure someone had tried to get in, and I explained everything, starting with the noise at the back door all the way to the footsteps outside my room. As I was talking, something hit me that made my stomach sink. The back door, which I had locked earlier, was now wide open. The cops took notes and said they'd check the neighborhood cameras, but judging by their expressions, I could tell they didn't expect to find much. After they left, I sat on the couch, trying to process everything. The Airbnb host finally replied to my message, claiming they had no idea what was going on and that nothing like this had ever happened before. That response pissed me off, but also made me wonder if they were telling the truth. Either way, I knew I wasn't staying there another night. I called a friend in Chicago and told him the whole story. He insisted I grab a cab and come to his place immediately. I packed my things as quickly as I could, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I stepped outside, I looked around but didn't see anyone. The silence out there was just as unnerving as the presence I'd felt earlier. I got to my friend's house just after midnight, still rattled but relieved to be somewhere safe. He tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a misunderstanding or some nosy neighbor. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. The next day, I got a call from the police. They told me they hadn't found anything on the nearby cameras, but mentioned something that made my skin crawl. The back door didn't seem to have been forced open. Someone either had a key or knew exactly how to unlock it. I tried calling the Airbnb host again, but they didn't pick up. Honestly, I wasn't even sure I wanted to hear their explanation. To this day, I still don't know what really happened that night. I've tried to rationalize it, but no matter how much I think about it, the same questions keep coming back. Who was at my door and why? And why didn't the cops find anything? I left a bad review on the Airbnb listing, warning people to stay away, but I never got a response from the host. Since then, I've avoided booking Airbnbs with vague profiles or in neighborhoods I'm not familiar with. Sometimes, late at night, when I hear strange noises at home, it all comes rushing back. And while I may never know the full story, I'm just glad I got out of there when I did.